Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we begin with one of the quietest and most recognizable trees in the northern world. A tree that can seem to stand apart even when it is surrounded by many others. From a distance, birch often looks pale against darker woods, as if it is holding a little more light than the forest around it. Even people who do not know many tree names often know birch when they see it. There is something about that smooth trunk, that paper-like peeling bark, and that soft brightness that makes the tree feel familiar almost immediately. If you have ever walked past a birch without stopping, you may still have noticed it in some small way. The trunk may have seemed almost white in low sun. The bark may have curled at the edges in thin little strips, as though the tree were gently shedding pages. In colder places, when so much of the landscape turns dark, grey, or bare, birch can seem to glow by comparison. It does not really shine, of course, but it reflects light in a way that draws the eye and settles the attention. That outer bark is one of the first remarkable things about birch. In many species, especially paper birch, the bark is thin and peels in fine, papery layers. Mature trunks are often smooth and marked with dark horizontal lines, called lenticels, small openings that help the tree exchange gases through the bark. The bright white color in many birches comes largely from a compound called betulin, a waxy substance that helps make the bark water-repelling and reflective. That same pale surface can help protect the trunk in winter by reflecting sunlight and reducing damage during freeze-thaw cycles. So the look of birch is not an accident. The papery peeling, the pale surface, the little dark marks running across the trunk, all of it belongs to the way the tree lives. Even before leaves return in spring, the bark is already doing work. The surface is dry, light, and protective. It is part shelter, part skin, part signal. And when you stand near a birch long enough, it begins to feel less like a plain trunk and more like one of the clearest examples of how a tree can be both useful and beautiful at the same time. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe, and if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this calm corner of the world, one sleepy traveler at a time. The quiet continues here, just as it is. Birch has another quality that makes it especially easy to stay with in a slow, sleepy way. It is a tree with strong details, but gentle ones. Oak can feel heavy. Pine can feel dense and shadowed. Birch feels lighter. Its leaves are small and delicate. Its branches flexible. And its canopy often allows light to pass through more easily than many other trees. Birch stands can feel bright and airy, with a soft rustling sound when wind moves through them. In autumn, those small leaves often turn a cheerful yellow, giving whole groves a golden glow before they fall. That lightness is part of why birch so often leaves such a clear impression. It is not only a tree you see, it is a tree you sense through contrast. A pale trunk against dark evergreens, thin leaves against a bright sky, a quiet rattling sound instead of a heavy hush. Birch forests often feel open and well lit, even before full leaf out, and that openness shapes the whole experience of being near them. There is also something quietly surprising about how much use has been found in this one tree. Birch bark is water resistant because of its oils and waxes. it rots slowly compared with the wood beneath it. In fact, old birch logs may lose much of their wood, while the bark remains as a hollow shell. That durability is one reason birch bark became so valuable to people for canoes, containers, coverings, and other practical objects. And yet the same bark that resists water can also catch flame very easily when dry. Even damp birch bark can ignite more readily than many people expect. So before we go any farther, birch has already given us several quiet mysteries to carry forward. Why should a tree wear bark that peels like paper? Why should that bark be white enough to reflect winter light? Why should one surface be both water resistant and so easy to burn? And why does birch so often seem to belong to edges, openings, and bright northern places where change is already underway? These are calm questions, but they are real ones. And they are part of what makes birch such a good tree to rest with for a while. It is simple enough to picture clearly, but layered enough to keep the mind gently occupied. The more closely you look, the more the trunk begins to explain itself. The more quietly you stay with it, the more the tree seems to reveal that its beauty is tied to function, and its softness is tied to survival. Tonight, we will stay with that pale bark a little longer. We will move closer to the surface, to those papery layers and dark little lines, and begin with the part of birch that people notice first, even when they do not yet know why they noticed it at all. From a distance, birch bark can seem almost simple, pale, smooth, easy to recognize. But as you move closer, the trunk begins to look less like one clean surface and more like a surface made of many fine layers resting gently against one another. What first seems solid begins to feel delicate. The bark does not sit tightly against the tree the way heavy ridged bark does on oak, or thick plaited bark does on pine. Instead, it loosens, it lifts, it curls at the edges. And in many birches, especially paper birch, it separates in such thin sheets that the comparison to paper hardly feels exaggerated at all. Seen from only a few inches away, the bark has a strangely quiet texture. Some strips cling closely to the trunk, almost flat, until the light catches their edges and reveals the small shadow beneath. Other strips curl away more visibly, making the surface look as though it is gently shedding pages. A little breeze can stir the loosest pieces. A little rain can darken the layers for a while and make their edges stand out more clearly. In some places, the bark looks dry and crisp. In others, it looks silky and thin, with a slight curl that makes the trunk feel less like wood and more like something folded by hand. This is one of the reasons birch stays so vividly in the mind. Its bark does not feel heavy or fixed. It feels changeable, even when the tree itself is standing perfectly still. The outer surface always seems to be in the middle of a slow revision. It is never losing itself completely, never coming apart in any dramatic way, but it is also never fully settled. The bark gives the impression that the trunk is quietly renewing its outermost layer over time. Across that pale surface run the little dark marks that make birch even more recognizable. They are short, horizontal lines, often scattered along the trunk like tiny dashes or strokes of ink. These are called lenticels. Even without knowing their name, most people notice them. They break the smooth brightness of the bark and give the trunk its distinct lined appearance. On a tree that might otherwise look blank from far away, They provide detail and rhythm up close. They make the bark look written rather than empty. But birch bark is not dead decoration. It is not simply a wrapping placed around the tree and left there. The trunk remains part of a living exchange between the tree and the air around it. Those lenticels are small pore-like openings that help gases move through the bark. The surface may look quiet, but it is not sealed. It remains involved in the tree's slow, ongoing contact with the world outside. The bark is part shelter, part boundary, part working surface. That is one reason birch does not quite feel shut down, even in colder weather. The trunk still seems open to light and air in a way that darker, heavier bark often does not. The peeling helps with that feeling too. As the outer layers lift and separate, the surface stays fresher. It becomes harder for mosses and lichens to settle too heavily and fully cover the trunk. Birch often keeps that cleaner, brighter look because the bark is always loosening itself in thin sheets, not all at once but gradually enough to keep the surface exposed. The tree does not hold on to an old outer layer forever. It lets it go in light curls and narrow strips, leaving the trunk looking cleaner and more open to light. There is something calming in all of this. The bark has detail, but not heaviness. Texture, but not roughness. It gives the eye many small things to rest on. A curled edge, a fine shadow, a row of dark lines crossing pale bark. Yet none of those details feel crowded or demanding. Birch rewards closeness. The more slowly you look, the more it seems to offer. And once the bark is seen this way, not as one plain outer layer, but as a living surface made of thin shifting sheets, the next question becomes even more specific. Why is it so often white? And why does that whiteness matter? The more closely you look at birch bark, the more its whiteness begins to feel like part of the tree's structure, rather than a simple color. It is not the flat white of paper on a table, or the blank white of paint on a wall. Birch bark carries light in a softer way. It reflects it, diffuses it, and seems to hold brightness on its surface, even when the woods around it are dark with rain, shade, or winter air. A birch trunk can stand among deeper greens and browns and still seem a little brighter than everything near it, as though the tree has found a way to keep daylight on itself. That pale surface comes largely from a substance called betulin. Betulin is a waxy compound found in the bark of many white-barked birches, and it is one of the main reasons those trunks look so bright. The whiteness is not something spread over the outside. It is built into the bark itself. In some birches, betulin makes up a large share of the outer bark, which is why the color can appear so strong and so clear even from a distance. Birch is not simply pale by chance. Its chemistry is pale. Betulin does more than make the tree look distinctive. It also helps make the bark water-repelling. Rain can fall across a birch grove, or melting snow can run down the trunks, and yet the bark often still seems dry-looking and clean, compared with darker bark that quickly appears soaked and heavy. That waxy quality helps keep too much moisture from settling into the surface. It protects the bark while also helping it keep its brightness. So the trunk is doing two things at once. It is managing light, and it is managing water. This matters especially in the colder parts of the year. Winter light can be surprisingly intense, particularly when snow covers the ground and throws sunlight back upward. On a very cold day, a dark trunk may absorb a great deal of warmth on the sunny side, only to cool quickly when the sun shifts or disappears. That repeated warming and cooling can put stress on the outer tissues of a tree. In some species, it can lead to injury, splitting, or a kind of winter sun damage often called sunscald. Birch reduces some of that risk by reflecting more of the sun instead of absorbing it. Its pale bark acts almost like a shield, softening the force of bright winter light before that light can do too much harm. So when a stand of birch seems to glow over snow, that brightness is not only beautiful, it is useful. The trees are not white for decoration. They are handling light in a way that helps protect the living tissues beneath the bark. There is something deeply elegant in that. One of the qualities that makes birch so visually memorable is also one of the qualities that helps it endure cold northern conditions. This becomes even more important during rapid freeze-thaw cycles. A bright winter day may warm the outer trunk for a short while, and then the temperature may drop sharply again. Birch bark helps reduce that sudden swing by reflecting more light and heat away. What looks gentle to the eye is, in practical terms, a defense against stress. The bark's whiteness may seem delicate, but it belongs to a very serious kind of protection. And the chemistry of that pale bark appears to do even more. Betulin and related compounds seem to make birch bark less welcoming to moisture-loving decay and less inviting to some fungi, bacteria, and insects. The trunk's outer layer is not simply smooth and pale. It is chemically guarded. That helps explain why birch bark can remain so distinct over time, holding on to its brightness, resisting wetness, and preserving a cleaner surface than many darker trunks nearby. If you stood among birches on a cold afternoon, you might begin to feel how much this changes the whole look of the grove. Light behaves differently there. The trunks return it. Shadows seem narrower. The woods feel clearer, less dense, more open to the eye. Birch does not only grow in bright northern light, it helps shape the way that light is seen. And yet the story of the bark is still not finished, because the same chemistry that helps keep the trunk bright, dry, and protected leads toward another quiet surprise. A pale surface that reflects winter light is already unusual, but birch does something stranger still, because that same bark can resist water and yet catch flame with surprising ease. And that quiet surprise begins in the same place as the whiteness, in the bark itself. The outer surface of birch is rich in waxes, oils, and protective compounds. Those substances help make the bark resistant to water, which is one reason a birch trunk can look so clean and dry even after rain or melting snow has run over it. Moisture does not settle into the surface as easily as it does on many darker, rougher trunks. Instead, the bark sheds water more readily, keeping that pale outer layer lighter, brighter, and less burdened by dampness. This gives birch a kind of calm practicality. The bark is not soft in the way cloth is soft, and not hard in the way stone is hard. It is something in between, a thin, flexible shield, dry to the touch, easy to peel, and unexpectedly durable. In northern forests, where cold, wet ground and long winters shape so much of life, that kind of surface matters. A tree that can hold water away from its trunk is already doing something useful for itself. But birch goes further than that. Over time, the bark can remain intact even when the wood beneath it has begun to weaken. An old fallen birch may lose much of its inner strength as fungi and moisture slowly work through the wood. Yet the outer bark can still cling to the shape of the log for a surprisingly long time. Sometimes a birch trunk becomes almost hollow from within, while the bark remains as a thin outer shell, still holding the memory of the tree's form. There is something haunting, but also strangely beautiful in that. The surface lasts. The outer layer keeps its shape. The bark does not give up quickly. That durability helps explain why people notice birch so early and so often. In a landscape full of trees, a bark that peels in sheets, sheds water, and stays intact long after cutting would not go unnoticed for very long. Birch bark could be lifted, folded, wrapped, stacked, carried, and used. It did not need to be carved from the trunk in blocks or chipped into pieces. It came away in layers. It offered itself in thin, strong sheets that were already useful almost the moment they were removed. In places where materials had to be gathered carefully from the land, this would have mattered a great deal. And yet the next surprise arrives almost quietly. A surface that resists water so well might seem as though it should also resist flame. But birch bark does not behave that way. When dry, it is highly flammable. Even when the air is damp, birch bark can still ignite more readily than many people expect. The same oils and waxes that help protect the bark from moisture also help it catch fire. A thin curled strip, once lit, may burn quickly and steadily, holding flame where other damp forest materials might only smoke. There is no need to force this into a contradiction. Birch is not breaking a rule. It is simply showing that one chemistry can lead to several different qualities at once. The bark repels water, resists decay, and also burns well, because all three belong to the same unusual surface. It is a reminder that the tree is not organized according to the categories people often prefer. Useful and fragile can sit together. Dry and living can sit together. Protective and flammable can sit together too. That is part of what made birch bark so valuable in northern forests. It could be used as a quick fire starter in wet country. It could be used as a covering, a container, or a wrapping because it did not absorb water too easily. It could protect the tree, and later, once removed, it could protect what people placed inside it. The bark was both a shield for the tree and a material for human hands. It belonged first to the life of birch, but it could go on serving a second life after that. If you imagine holding a strip of birch bark, that second life begins to make sense. The piece would be light in the hand, thin but not weak, dry with a faint curve already in it, pale on the outside, warmer in tone beneath, easy to bend, hard to soak, quick to burn. It does not feel like bark in the heavy, ordinary sense. It feels closer to a crafted material, though it was grown rather than made. And perhaps that is why birch bark stays so memorable. It does not behave quite the way bark is expected to behave. It peels like paper, stays bright in wet weather, holds together after the wood begins to fail, and still burns with surprising ease. If one surface can repel water, resist decay, and catch flame so readily, it begins to feel less like bark in the ordinary sense, and more like one of birch's great inventions. If you look at a birch trunk from far away, the small black lines across the bark may seem like part of the pattern and nothing more. They break up the pale surface. They give the trunk a little contrast. They make the bark look written rather than blank. But up close, those dark marks become more interesting. They are not stains, and they are not cracks in the ordinary sense. They are lenticels, small openings in the bark that help the tree exchange gases with the air around it. In a quiet way, they are part of how the trunk breathes. That may seem surprising at first, because bark often feels like the sealed outer layer of a tree, a kind of fixed covering placed over the living wood beneath. Birch does not quite give that impression. Its bark peels. It loosens in thin sheets. It stays bright through winter. And those little lenticels suggest that the trunk is not closed off from the world outside. The surface is protective, yes, but it is not sealed shut. Air still moves across it and through it, in very small exchanges that continue whether or not anyone notices them. These lenticels are one of the reasons birch bark looks so distinctive. They usually run sideways across the trunk in short, dark dashes, almost as though the tree has been marked with tiny strokes of charcoal. On a smooth white surface, they stand out clearly. They make the trunk look lined and lightly written over. But their beauty is tied to function. The marks are visible because they are openings, places where the bark allows part of the tree's ongoing exchange with the air to continue. And birch bark is thin enough that the story does not end there. Light can penetrate the outer surface more than many people might expect. Even before leaves return, even in late winter, when the branches still look bare and still, some of the tissues beneath the bark can remain quietly active. In a simple sense, the trunk is not as dormant as it appears. It is not producing the full green energy of summer leaves, of course. But the tree has not gone entirely silent. There is still contact with light. There is still gas exchange. There is still a small amount of activity continuing close to the surface. That gives birch a different feeling in winter than many other trees. A dark, rough trunk can seem closed, heavy, and fully withdrawn until spring opens it again. Birch does not feel quite that way. The trunk stays bright. The lenticels remain visible. The bark itself looks alert to light, even when the canopy above is empty. It is one of the reasons a birch grove can feel so awake in cold weather, even when everything around it seems paused. If you stood close to one trunk on a pale winter afternoon, you might see all of this at once. The peeling layers lifting softly from the bark, the dark lenticels crossing the surface in small horizontal rows, the white trunk catching light and giving some of it back. The whole tree would appear still, but not lifeless. Quiet, but not fully asleep. Even with no leaves moving above you, there would be a sense that the tree was still in contact with the season, still exchanging, still waiting in a more active way than it first appeared. There is something deeply calming in that kind of stillness. Not the stillness of complete stoppage, but the stillness of slow, hidden work. Birch does not need to announce that work. It does not flower brightly in winter or push out new leaves before its time. It simply keeps certain small exchanges going beneath its bark, behind its pale surface, through openings so small that most people pass them without a thought. And perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons of birch. A tree may look still from the outside and yet remain quietly active within. A bright trunk marked with tiny dark lines may seem simple from far away, but up close it reveals a more careful design, a surface that protects, breathes, receives light, and continues its work through the cold. The tree already looks calm from the outside, but inside the bark small exchanges are continuing, which makes birch feel less dormant than it first appears. Now it helps to step back from the trunk and see birch the way it is usually encountered, not as one pale surface close to the eye, but as a whole stand of trees rising together. The feeling changes immediately. Instead of looking at bark from only a few inches away, you begin to notice the grove itself, the spacing of the trunks, the thin branches overhead, the way light moves through the leaves, and the way the whole stand feels less heavy than many other forests. Birch does not usually make a dark ceiling above you. It makes something lighter, finer, and more open. The leaves are part of that feeling. Birch leaves are relatively small, often only a few inches across, and they have a light, delicate shape. They are usually ovate, with a pointed tip, and their edges are doubly serrated, which means each larger tooth along the edge is lined with smaller teeth of its own. That may sound like a small detail, but it changes the whole look of the leaf. Birch leaves do not feel broad and solid. They feel precise, lightly cut, and almost fluttering even when they are still. Because the leaves are small and the branching is fine, a birch canopy often feels open rather than dense. The crown does not shut out the sky in the way a thick beech canopy might, and it does not cast the same kind of deep, steady shade as a stand of conifers. Light gets through. It moves between the leaves, reaches the ground, and keeps the space below from feeling fully enclosed. That is one reason birch woods can feel so breathable. Even when you are clearly inside them, you do not always feel covered over by them. The branches help create that feeling too. Birch branches are flexible, and when wind moves through them, they do not resist in a stiff, rigid way. They give a little. The leaves tremble. The smallest twigs shift, and instead of the deeper hush or dense murmur of heavier trees, birch often produces a lighter sound, a soft, restless rustling that seems to move quickly through the canopy. It is not loud. It does not ask for attention, but it gives the stand a kind of airy voice, a constant, delicate motion in sound as well as in light. This openness changes the forest floor beneath birch as well. Because more light passes through the canopy, the ground below many birch stands can support a richer layer of herbs, grasses, and low plants than the ground beneath darker, denser woods. In some places, the understory feels almost continuous, not bare and shadowed, but softly filled in. A birch stand can therefore seem bright from above and alive from below at the same time. The trunks lift the eye upward, but the ground does not disappear into darkness. Even before the leaves fully return, birch woods often feel spacious and well lit. That is another part of their distinct character. Some forests feel closed until summer opens them. Birch can feel open much earlier. The pale trunks already carry light. The fine branching already lets the sky remain visible. So by the time the leaves arrive, the grove does not transform from dark to light. So much has become richer within an openness that was already there. Then autumn changes the whole stand again. Birch leaves often turn a bright, cheerful yellow before they fall. Not the deep red of maple, and not the rust brown of oak, but a clearer yellow that can make whole groves appear washed in gold. Because the leaves are small and numerous, that color spreads evenly through the canopy, and for a brief time the whole stand seems to glow from within. The pale trunks below and the yellow leaves above belong together. One catches light all year, the other gathers it for a little while before letting it go. So the feeling of a birch stand comes from many small things working together. Small leaves, fine teeth along the edges, flexible branches, filtered light, a soft rustling sound, bright trunks below and yellow leaves above. None of these traits is especially forceful on its own, but together they create a woodland that feels airy, light-filled, and quietly awake. And that openness is part of why birch forests feel so breathable. It also hints at something larger about the tree itself, because birch often belongs to places where light has recently returned and where the life of a forest is beginning again in a more open form. And that raises a gentle question. What kind of tree thrives not in deep, unbroken shade, but in places where light has suddenly returned? What kind of tree does especially well when a patch of land has been opened, cleared, burned, or shaken loose from what was there before? Birch is one of the clearest answers to that question. It is a classic pioneer species, a tree built not only to live in forests, but to arrive early when a forest is just beginning to form again. A pioneer species is a species that moves into open ground quickly, especially after disturbance. In the case of birch, that disturbance can take many forms. A wildfire may pass through and leave bare soil behind. Logging may remove an older stand and open the canopy to full sun. Strong wind may bring down a group of trees at once, leaving a wide gap full of light. In colder regions, shifting water, frost, slope failure, or other changes in the land can also create the kind of open ground birch likes. Where many slower trees need shelter or establish shade to begin, birch often does best in brightness. That brightness matters because birch is not a tree that waits patiently in darkness for years and years. It is much better at moving into open, disturbed ground where the sun can reach the surface freely. In those places, birch seedlings can establish quickly, and young birches can rise fast enough to claim the space before other species fully settle in. That is one reason birch stands often feel young, clear, and full of upward motion. They are frequently associated with landscapes in transition, not because they are weak, but because they are especially good at the earlier stages of return. This can make birch one of the first visible signs that a damaged landscape is beginning again. Imagine a hillside after fire, with ash, exposed soil, scattered remains of older trunks, and wide open sky above. At first, the ground may look empty. Then, over time, tiny seedlings appear. Then thin stems. Then more and more of them, until what looked bare begins to gather pale vertical lines. A few years later, those lines are small birches. A few years after that, the whole slope may hold a young stand, bright and close together, leaves moving lightly in open air. In some places, birch comes in so successfully that it can form nearly pure stands for a time. Not always, and not everywhere, but often enough that whole young groves may be filled mostly with birch. This is especially likely where disturbance has created exactly the conditions birch prefers: open light, exposed ground, and reduced competition in the first years of regrowth. The stand may look settled once it forms, but it is still part of an earlier chapter in the life of the forest. Birch is often among the first trees to claim that chapter. There is something fitting in that, because birch already looks like a tree of beginning. Its pale bark reflects light. Its canopy lets light through. Its leaves are small and quick to move. Even its bark peels in freshening layers. So when birch appears early after disturbance, it almost seems visually matched to the role. It is not only a tree that tolerates openness, it looks like a tree meant for open places. That does not mean birch remains dominant forever. In many forests, other species begin to rise beneath or beside it as time passes. Shade-tolerant trees may slowly gather under the birch canopy. Longer-lived species may eventually take over the stand. But birch's role in those earlier years is still crucial. It covers the land. It stabilizes the return of tree cover. It helps turn open space back into woodland. And because of that, birch does not belong only to old, quiet groves with white trunks and filtered light. It also belongs to recovery. It belongs to the first visible stage of return. When a place has been damaged, opened, or stripped back to brightness, birch is often one of the species most ready to answer. That is part of why a birch stand can feel so hopeful, without ever seeming dramatic. It is not only beautiful in itself, it is often evidence that something has started over. Not all at once, and not in a loud way, but steadily, with small leaves, thin trunks, and increasing light held in bark. Birch is not just a tree that stands quietly in old woods. Very often, it is one of the first signs that a damaged landscape has begun again. And that return often begins at a scale so small, it would be easy to miss if you were only looking for trunks. Before there is a young grove, before there are pale stems rising from open ground, there are seeds. Birch produces great numbers of them, and each one is small, light, and built for movement. They do not fall with the heavy certainty of acorns, and they do not arrive in thick cones like pine seeds waiting to be released. Birch seeds are finer than that, closer to flakes than to nuts, and they are made to travel. They develop in catkins, those slender clusters that hang from the branches and change through the season. By the time the seeds are ready, the catkins begin to loosen and break apart, releasing countless tiny bodies into the air. Some fall nearby. Others are carried farther by even modest wind. A birch does not need every seed to survive. It succeeds by making many, scattering widely, and letting open ground decide where the next stand will begin. There is something very fitting in that method. Birch is a tree of light and openness, and its seeds travel in a way that matches that character. They move lightly. They do not arrive with force. They drift, settle, lift again, and cross whatever open space the season gives them. In northern places, this can happen late enough in the year that seeds scatter across snow. The image suits birch perfectly. Tiny seeds moving over a pale landscape, almost invisible against the cold brightness below. Snow can help in its own quiet way. It keeps the ground open and clean. It can help carry seeds farther across exposed surfaces. Wind can skim them over drifts, across frozen edges, and into places where the ground will later open more fully in spring. A winter landscape may look still, but in that stillness, birch can already be setting the next stage in motion. Long before leaves emerge, long before green growth returns in any obvious form, the tree may already be sending the future outward in thousands of small pieces. Yet movement alone is not enough. A seed also needs the right place to land. Birch does especially well where disturbance has left bare mineral soil or a thin, open surface with plenty of light. After fire, after logging, after wind throw, or after other disruptions that clear away heavy litter and shade, birch often finds exactly what it needs. Dense layers of unbroken moss, leaves, or thick ground cover can make establishment harder. But open, disturbed soil, especially with sunlight reaching it, gives those tiny seeds a much better chance. That is one reason birch so often follows change. Its seeds are not built to wait hidden in darkness for many years. They are built to travel when opportunity appears and to settle quickly where the ground has been opened. In that sense, birch regeneration can begin almost invisibly. At first, there is no grove, no obvious stand, nothing that would catch the eye from a distance. There are only seeds crossing cold air, settling onto open earth, and waiting for the season to shift. If you imagined a burned hillside in late winter, you might first notice only the blackened remains of what was there before. Then perhaps a little snow lingering in the hollows. Then wind moving over open ground. What you would not notice at first are the thousands of birch seeds arriving there, too small to command attention, too light to announce themselves. But they are part of the same landscape. They belong to the return long before the return has taken visible form. This is one of the quiet strengths of birch. It does not need to begin at a large scale. It begins in numbers, in lightness, in movement, in the ability to let wind do part of the work. The future birch stand is present long before the first recognizable sapling is tall enough to identify. It exists first as possibility crossing winter ground, and perhaps that is why birch recovery can seem so sudden later on. What appears to be a quick return is often the result of many small beginnings that happened earlier and farther away than anyone noticed. The grove does not start when the trunks become visible. It starts when the seeds leave the catkins and enter the open air. The return of birch often begins almost invisibly, with thousands of seeds moving through cold light before any new trunk is tall enough to notice. From what travels through the air, it helps to move down into what spreads through the ground. Birch arrives lightly above the surface, with small seeds carried by wind, but once it begins to establish itself, much of its strategy shifts below. The roots of birch do not usually drive straight down in the heavy, deep-anchored way people sometimes imagine when they think of trees. Instead, birch tends to spread more broadly near the surface, sending roots outward through the upper layers of soil, where light, disturbance, and quick opportunity have already shaped the land. That kind of root system fits the rest of the tree's character. Birch is often one of the first trees to move into open ground, and open ground is not always stable, rich, or deeply settled. After fire, after logging, after wind throw, or after some other disruption, the soil near the surface may be the part most ready for immediate use. A tree that can spread through that upper layer quickly has an advantage. Birch does not wait for the whole ground to become ideal. It reaches outward through what is available and begins holding the place as it is. These roots are often shallow, but they are not weak. A shallow root system can still be broad, and breadth matters. It helps the young tree steady itself in loose or disturbed soil. It helps the tree gather water and nutrients across a wider area. And in the earlier stages of regrowth, when many seedlings are competing in the same bright open space, that wide near-surface reach allows birch to claim ground quickly. The tree is not trying to become a deep solitary pillar. It is trying to arrive, spread, and make use of the conditions that are there right now. There is something very quiet about that strategy. If you were standing in a young birch stand, you would see only the thin trunks and the moving leaves. You would not see the shallow web beneath them, crossing outward through the upper soil, helping hold each young tree in place. But that hidden spread is part of why birch can establish itself so effectively after disturbance. The tree's visible lightness depends in part on an invisible broadness below. At the same time, that same pattern brings its own limits. A tree whose roots remain closer to the surface can be more vulnerable when the upper soil dries out. Birch often does best in places that are cool, moist, and open, and its root system reflects that preference. In prolonged drought, or in ground where deeper-rooted trees begin to dominate the competition, birch can be at a disadvantage. It has breadth, but not always depth. It can move in quickly, but it does not always hold the site forever when conditions change. That too fits the larger rhythm of birch. It is a tree of quick arrival, quick use of light, quick response to opening. It is not always the tree that remains for the longest span. The roots tell the same story the bark and seeds have already suggested. Birch is built for response. It is built for movement into opportunity. Its strength lies in early spread rather than permanent command. And birch has another quiet advantage below ground. Younger trees, especially after damage, can often sprout again from the base or from the root collar. So even when a stem is broken, scorched, cut back, or otherwise harmed, the tree may still answer from low down, close to the place where trunk and roots meet. That means the visible stem is not always the whole story of the tree. Damage above ground does not always mean the end of growth. A birch can return from near its own base, drawing on what remains below. This makes the root system feel less like a foundation in the static sense and more like a reserve of possibility. The tree holds itself, feeds itself, and sometimes begins again from that same hidden structure. A grove may seem delicate when viewed from above, all pale stems and trembling leaves, but the life beneath it is broader and more persistent than the trunks alone suggest. So much of birch depends on that balance. Light seeds above, wide roots below, quick arrival in open places, fast claim of the upper soil, readiness to respond when damaged. Birch does not rely on deep anchoring so much as broad reach, and that fits the rest of its strategy: quick arrival, quick spread, and quick response to change. Fire reveals something important about birch because it shows both the tree's fragility and its resilience at the same time. The bark may look like a protective surface, and in many ways it is, but it is also thin. That thinness matters when flame moves through a stand. Birch bark does not insulate the trunk in the way thick bark does on some other trees. A hotter fire can damage or kill the above-ground stem quickly, especially in younger trees whose bark has not had much time to deepen or toughen. The same trunk that reflects winter light so beautifully is not built to endure long, direct heat. And yet that does not mean birch is poorly suited to landscapes shaped by fire. In fact, birch often does something more subtle than simple resistance. It does not always stand through fire unchanged. Very often, it returns after it. This is part of what makes birch so interesting. A tree can be vulnerable in one moment and well positioned in the next. Fire may top-kill young stems, scorching or destroying the visible trunk. But younger birches can often sprout again from the base or root collar afterward. Growth begins low, close to the ground, from tissues that were less exposed than the stem above. So the tree's answer to damage is not always to preserve what was there before. Sometimes it is to begin again from beneath it. That kind of return suits birch. It is not a tree that insists on permanence in one exact form. Its bark peels, its canopies stay open, its seeds travel widely, its roots spread near the surface and respond quickly when conditions change. So when fire passes through and removes what had been standing, birch often responds in the same spirit. It does not simply endure, it reappears. Fire can also create the very seedbeds birch prefers. When flames clear litter, open the canopy, and expose bare mineral soil, they leave behind exactly the kind of bright, disturbed ground where birch seeds can establish well. What looks destructive in one sense becomes, for birch, an opening in another. More light reaches the ground. Competition is reduced for a time. The surface is cleared, and into that changed place, birch can move with unusual speed, whether by sprouting from surviving roots or by seeding into the new openness from nearby trees. If you imagine a forest after fire, the first impression may be one of absence. Darkened trunks, open ground, a wide, exposed sky where a canopy once closed overhead. It can feel as though the place has been emptied. But for birch, that emptiness is not only loss, it is also opportunity. The exposed soil, the increased light, the reduced shade, all of these are conditions birch knows how to use. What has become difficult for one stage of the forest may become ideal for another. This is why birch can seem to follow fire so naturally in some northern landscapes. Not because it is invulnerable to burning, but because its whole strategy fits what comes after. It can be harmed quickly, yes. Thin bark leaves little room for heavy insulation. But the species is also well adapted to the open ground and shifting conditions that fire leaves behind. That combination makes birch feel less like a tree that defeats disturbance and more like a tree that understands how to live with it. There is something quietly reassuring in that pattern. Strength does not always mean refusing damage. Sometimes it means responding well once damage has happened. Birch may lose stems. It may blacken. It may seem briefly overwhelmed by heat. But then pale shoots return from the base. Tiny seeds settle into exposed soil. Thin new trunks rise where the older stand was broken. And in time, the same landscape that looked emptied begins to gather brightness again. So fire does not tell a simple story about birch. It tells a double one. The tree is vulnerable because its bark is thin. The tree is resilient because its regrowth is quick, and because the conditions fire leaves behind often favor its return. Fragile bark and vigorous recovery sit side by side in the same species, just as water resistance and flammability do in the bark itself. Birch can be harmed quickly, but that does not make it weak. In many places, It is one of the clearest examples of a tree that knows how to come back. By the time fire has passed, or winter has thinned the woods to bare branches, birch is already preparing for a different kind of movement. Not the movement of seeds through open air now, and not the movement of flame through bark, but the quiet upward movement of sap. Long before the canopy fills in again, while the grove can still look pale and spare from a distance, water is already beginning to rise inside the trunks. Spring does not begin all at once in birch. It begins inwardly, with pressure building low in the tree and lifting clear sap toward branches that have not yet leafed out. This happens early, before the buds fully open. A birch stand may still look bare to the eye, with fine twigs against the sky and no full green softness yet overhead. But inside the trunk, the season is already changing. Sap starts to move up through the wood, carrying water and dissolved sugars from the roots toward the upper parts of the tree. It is one of the quietest signs of spring, because nothing dramatic is visible at first. No sudden flowers, no instant canopy, just an inner filling, slow and upward, hidden inside bark that still looks almost winter white. In birch, that sap flow is driven mainly by root pressure. That is an important difference, because people often think first of maple when they think of sap rising in spring. Maple flow depends heavily on the repeated freezing and thawing of nights and days. Birch follows a different pattern. Its sap begins to move when the roots become active enough to push water upward from below. In practical terms, birch usually waits for a slightly warmer turn in the season. Significant flow often comes when temperatures settle closer to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warmer than the classic maple cycle. So birch does not begin with the sharp back and forth of late winter. It begins when the ground and roots are ready to press upward more steadily. That makes the whole process feel softer. The tree is not reacting only to the swing between freezing and thawing. It is responding to a broader warming, a deeper change moving through the soil. The roots begin to work again. Pressure builds, and the trunk becomes a pathway for water before the leaves have fully announced themselves. If you could imagine the inside of a birch at that time, it would not look empty or paused. It would feel as though the tree were quietly filling from below, like a long pale vessel receiving the season through its roots. The sap itself is clear, thin, and only slightly sweet. It does not have the dense sugary feel people might imagine from syrup. In its natural state, birch sap is more like cool spring water, touched with a light sweetness. That is part of why it has been gathered and drunk in northern regions for so long. It is a seasonal liquid, brief and fresh, collected at a time of year when snow may still linger in patches and the branches may still look nearly bare. In some places, it has been used as a tonic. In others, boiled down into birch syrup, which is much rarer than maple syrup and darker in character, often described as fruity and caramelized once concentrated. There is something especially fitting about birch offering this kind of spring sign. So much about the tree already suggests transition. The bark peels in layers. The trunks brighten winter light. The species arrives quickly after disturbance. And now, before its leaves even unfold, it begins to move water upward in a way that makes the whole tree feel one step ahead of what the eye can see. Birch often looks open and still from the outside at this time of year, but the stillness is already changing. If you stood in a birch grove during that early part of spring, you might notice how quiet the place remains. The canopy is still thin. The air is still cool. The ground may still carry the memory of winter, but within the trunks, something is already underway. Water is rising. Pressure is building from the roots. The tree is preparing its branches long before the leaves make that preparation obvious. At a time of year when the forest still looks bare, birch is already moving water upward, which makes spring feel as though it begins inside the tree before it becomes visible outside. And once that spring movement is understood as something real, rising quietly through the trunk before the leaves fully open, it becomes easier to understand why people began paying such close attention to birch sap. The tree is not simply carrying water upward for its own purposes. For a short window each year, that movement can also be gathered. A small opening made in the trunk can allow sap to flow out, clear and cool. And what begins as the hidden motion of spring inside the tree becomes something visible, collectible, and even drinkable. Birch sap can be tapped in much the same broad spirit as maple sap, though the season and the character of the liquid are different. The sap is gathered during that brief spring interval when root pressure is pushing it upward, before the leaves have fully emerged, and while the tree is still in that poised state between winter quiet and full green growth. A container is placed to catch the flow, and over time the tree offers a clear liquid that seems almost like cold water at first glance. But it is not plain water. It carries dissolved sugars and minerals upward through the trunk, and those give it its slight sweetness and its distinctive seasonal freshness. If the sap is boiled down, it becomes birch syrup. This is one of the most direct ways a tree can be tasted. Yet birch syrup is much rarer than maple syrup, and part of the reason is simple. Birch sap contains less sugar, so it takes a great deal of liquid to make a small amount of finished syrup. The boiling process is longer, and the result is not merely a darker version of maple. It becomes something with a character of its own, often deeper, more caramelized, and sometimes with notes people describe as fruitier or even lightly molasses-like. Where maple syrup feels bright and familiar, birch syrup often feels darker, wilder, and more strongly tied to the tree itself. That difference suits birch. It has always been a tree of unusual surfaces and quiet surprises. Its bark peels like paper. Its whiteness reflects winter light. It resists water and yet burns easily. So it makes sense that its syrup, too, would be less expected, less common, and a little more complex in taste than many people assume. Even the flavor seems to belong to the same larger identity, not loud, but distinctive once noticed. Many birch species can be tapped, not only paper birch. In northern regions, people have collected sap from several kinds of birch depending on what grows nearby. This widens the practice beyond one single image of the tree and ties it more broadly to birch as a genus. Wherever birches are abundant and spring arrives with that upward movement in the sap, the possibility of tapping exists. The exact taste may vary somewhat from species to species and place to place, but the underlying act remains the same, drawing a little of the season out of the trunk while it is on its way to the branches. At the same time, birch asks for more care. It is less tolerant of wounding than maple, and that means tapping must be done carefully and sparingly. The bark is thin. The tree's protective surface is distinctive, but not especially thick. An unnecessary injury can matter more. So there is a kind of respect built into the practice. To tap birch well is not simply to take sap, because it is there. It is to understand that the tree is offering something during a narrow seasonal moment, and that the opening made in return should be as limited and careful as possible. That connects physiology, season, and culture in a particularly beautiful way. The same root pressure that lifts sap toward unopened leaves becomes, for a short time, part of human attention and habit. The same northern spring that still looks pale and incomplete to the eye becomes the season when sap is watched, gathered, boiled, and tasted. A hidden process inside the tree enters daily life, not by changing what it is, but by becoming visible to people who know when to look. And perhaps that is why birch tapping feels so intimate. It does not only depend on the tree, it depends on timing, on noticing the season precisely, on knowing that before full leaf out, before the grove seems fully awake, something has already begun to move inside it. When people tap birch, they are not only collecting sweetness, they are drawing directly from a tree whose spring movement can actually be tasted. From that brief spring movement, it helps to widen the view and ask where birch belongs most naturally, not just in one grove or on one hillside, but across whole regions of the world. And again, the tree's character gives part of the answer before any explanation does. Birch feels most at home in cool, moist climates, in places where winters are long, light can be sharp, and the growing season is real, but never especially luxurious. It belongs to landscapes where the year spends a great deal of time leaning toward cold. That is why birch is so deeply tied to the northern world. Across Canada and Alaska, across Scandinavia, across the immense stretches of Siberia, birch appears again and again as one of the defining trees of cool climates and boreal forests. It stands at forest edges, on uplands, along cool slopes, near openings, beside lakes and wetlands, and in all the transitional places where light, moisture, and cold meet in changing balance. In some regions, it mixes with spruce and fir. In others, it shares ground with aspens, maples, or pines. But even when it is only part of a larger forest, it often remains one of the easiest trees to notice, because its bark keeps gathering light where darker trunks let it go. There is something fitting in the fact that birch ranges so widely across northern lands. The tree seems built for those conditions in several ways at once. Its pale bark reflects bright winter sun. Its thin, flexible branches move easily under wind and weather. Its seeds travel well across open ground and snow. Its early growth helps it use the long summer light once warmth finally arrives. None of these traits alone would explain birch's presence across so much of the north, but together, they begin to show why the tree fits so naturally into cold places. Paper birch, in particular, can tolerate remarkable cold. In some northern areas, it survives temperatures dropping well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. That kind of endurance changes the way you look at the tree. A pale trunk with papery bark can seem delicate at first glance, almost too refined for harsh conditions. But birch is not fragile in the way it first appears. Its surface may be thin, its leaves may be light, and its canopy may feel airy. Yet it is still a tree shaped by climates that test every living thing for endurance. The birch does not answer that test with heaviness. It answers with chemistry, timing, flexibility, and light. And the places birch often occupies tell the same story. It is common on cooler uplands where soils drain well, but moisture still lingers in the air and ground. It appears on north-facing or otherwise cool slopes where summer heat is softened a little. It often occupies forest margins and more open northern sites where sunlight is abundant, but the air remains relatively cool. It can follow disturbance into those places, but even where disturbance is not the main story, birch often seems most itself where brightness and cold exist together. If you picture a birch grove in one of those regions, the image has a distinct clarity to it. Pale trunks rising through snow, dark evergreens standing farther back, air that feels clean and sharp rather than humid and heavy, a sky that may be bright even on the coldest days. The light in such places is often striking, especially in late winter and early spring, and birch seems almost designed to live inside that brightness without being damaged by it. Its bark gives some of the light back. Its branches hold out through the season. Its whole structure feels adapted not just to surviving the north, but to being visible there. This is one reason birch can feel so strongly associated with stillness and cold weather calm. The tree belongs to places where the year slows down for long stretches, where snow stays, where thaw arrives gradually, where growth is intense but limited to a shorter season. Birch seems to understand that rhythm. It does not rush to become massive. It does not darken into deep density. It stays lighter, clearer, and more responsive to the edge between dormancy and return. So when birch is seen only as a pretty white trunk, something important is missed. The whiteness is part of a larger climatic life. The bark, the timing of sap, the openness of the canopy, the quick response after disturbance, all of it makes more sense when placed against long winters and cool, bright air. Birch feels at home where winters are long and light can be sharp, and many of its strangest features make more sense when seen against that kind of cold. From climate, it helps to move into time. Not the short time of a season now, or the brief spring interval when sap begins to rise, but the longer time of a tree's whole life. Birch is a tree that often grows quickly, in the right conditions, with light, moisture, and space enough to establish itself well. A young birch can gain height at a pace that feels almost eager, compared with slower, heavier forest trees. This fits everything else already seen in it. Birch arrives early after disturbance. It takes advantage of open ground. It makes use of bright conditions before shade deepens. A tree built for that kind of beginning cannot afford to be slow. So birch often spends the first part of its life in upward motion. Thin stems become small trunks. Small trunks become a stand. A hillside that once looked open begins to fill with pale vertical lines, and then with leaves held high enough to filter light rather than simply receive it. The growth is not chaotic, but it can feel quick. Birch does not merely occupy the open space, it rises into it. This quickness gives birch one of its most striking qualities. Even when the trunks are not especially massive, a birch stand can feel complete surprisingly early. The trees may still be young in the scale of a forest, yet already tall enough to create a clear identity of place. Light moves through the canopy. The understory begins to change. The ground feels more wooded than open. Birch can make a landscape feel like forest again, before many slower species would have reached the same stage. But that speed belongs to a trade. Birch is relatively short-lived compared with many major forest trees. It does not usually hold dominance for centuries in the way some oaks, beeches, or conifers can. Its strength is not deep permanence. Its strength is timely presence. Birch rises quickly, establishes itself well, and helps shape an early chapter in the life of a forest. But often it is not the tree that remains longest once the stand matures. Paper birch shows this pattern clearly. Major height growth often slows around 60 to 70 years. The tree may live beyond that, of course, and individual birches can persist for a good while longer under the right conditions, but the period of most vigorous upward expansion does not continue indefinitely. That early energy eventually eases. The stand that once seemed to rise so rapidly begins, very gradually, to settle into a different rhythm. Very old birches do exist, but they are not common, especially in warmer conditions or where competition from longer-lived species becomes strong. Birch seems to belong most naturally to the earlier and middle passages of forest time, rather than the deepest old age of a stand. This does not diminish the tree. In some ways, it makes it more moving. Birch is not built to dominate endlessly. It is built to arrive, brighten, shelter, and prepare. There is a quiet poignancy in that. A birch stand can feel so light-filled, so present, so vividly itself, and yet part of that beauty comes from the fact that it is not forever. The trunks are not trying to become immovable monuments. They are part of a quicker cycle. They answer disturbance. They use light while it is available. They turn open ground into young woodland. And then, over time, they begin to give way. Even visually, this feels true. Birch does not have the dense, permanent authority of some trees. Its leaves are small, its bark peels. Its branches are fine and flexible. Its whiteness catches the eye, but in a way that feels exposed rather than fortified. It is a tree of presence, not of mass. A tree of response, not of long command. Its lifespan carries the same character as its surface. If you imagine two forests, one dominated by very long-lived species and one by birch, the difference would not only be botanical, it would be temporal. The birch forest would feel more like a bright interval, a stage in motion, a chapter that matters greatly precisely because it does not last forever. That does not make it lesser, it makes it different. Birch occupies time the way it occupies light, quickly, clearly, and with a kind of temporary brilliance. And that is part of why birch can stay so memorable in the mind. It rises quickly, shines brightly, and then often yields its place, which gives it a different rhythm from trees built to dominate for centuries. And that yielding does not need to be understood as decline in the harsh sense. It can be understood as part of the larger work birch does in a forest. A birch stand is often not only a stand of trees. It is a kind of preparation. It occupies the middle part of succession in many northern landscapes, arriving after disturbance, growing quickly into the light, and then slowly shaping the conditions that will allow other trees to follow. Birch does not simply fill space. It changes space. That change begins above and below at once. The canopy of birch is open enough to let light reach the ground, but not so open that the land remains in the raw, exposed condition it had just after disturbance. The stand softens brightness without removing it completely. Shade appears, but it is a filtered shade, lighter and more breathable than the shade beneath denser forests. The air below the canopy becomes cooler and steadier. Moisture lingers differently. Wind is broken, but not entirely stopped. In that gentler middle condition, the forest floor begins to shift. Birch litter plays a role in that shift as well. Each year, the small leaves fall and settle onto the ground. They do not form the same kind of dense, slowly changing blanket that some heavier leaves do. Birch litter tends to break down relatively quickly, returning organic matter to the upper soil and helping reshape the forest floor into something less raw and more habitable for other forms of growth. What was once exposed ground after fire, logging, or some other opening begins to gather a softer surface. The stand is no longer only occupying the site. It is modifying it. That matters because many of the trees that come later in succession need different conditions from the ones birch itself prefers. Birch does especially well in brightness, but beneath a maturing birch stand, where the ground is no longer fully open and the soil has begun to change, seedlings of more shade-tolerant trees often start to appear. In some places, these may be conifers such as spruce or fir. In others, they may be maples or other northern hardwoods. At first, they may be easy to miss, small and scattered beneath the more obvious white trunks above. But over time, those quieter arrivals become part of the next stage. There is something almost generous in the role birch plays here. It does not merely take advantage of disturbance for itself, and then hold the site in a fixed way for as long as possible. Instead, it often prepares the landscape for other trees that will eventually replace it. Its leaves help build the soil. Its canopy alters the light. Its roots help stabilize the ground. Its stand creates a middle condition between open, damaged land and later, denser woodland. Birch becomes part of the bridge from one state to another. And that is why replacement does not feel like failure in the case of birch. The species is often doing exactly what its larger rhythm suggests it should do. It arrives early. It responds quickly. It occupies the bright chapter after disturbance. Then, as conditions gradually shift, it makes room. Not suddenly, and not all at once, but by helping create a forest floor and light pattern where others can begin. Birch does not lose the forest in the ordinary sense. It helps hand the forest onward. If you stood in such a stand during that middle period, you might still notice mostly the birches. Their bark would still catch the eye. Their leaves would still move lightly above you. But if you looked lower, into the understory, and among the younger growth, you might begin to see signs of what comes next. Darker needles, broader leaves, small trees growing patiently beneath the lighter canopy. The birch stand would still be fully itself, yet already carrying the future in quiet form beneath it. That is part of what makes birch forests feel so beautiful. They often hold more than one time at once. They show the success of birch in the present, but they also reveal the beginning of another forest gathering below. The stand is not static. It is layered in time as well as in space. The white trunks belong to the current stage, while the smaller trees beneath them may belong to what will follow. So a birch stand is often beautiful partly because it is temporary. It is a forest in transition, already making room for the future as it grows. And that future does not arrive all at once. A birch forest rarely gives way in a single visible moment. The change is slower than that, stretched across years and then decades, until the stand that once looked bright, young, and full of upward motion begins to feel a little thinner, a little more open in a different way. Not the hopeful openness of early regrowth now, but the quieter openness that comes when age begins to loosen what was once tightly gathered. As birch stands grow older, the first signs of change may be subtle. Some trunks begin to decline earlier than others. Openings appear where a tree has weakened or fallen. The canopy becomes less even. Light starts reaching the ground in new patterns, not only because birch leaves are small and airy, but because there are now small absences among them. A grove that once looked almost uniform in its pale vertical rhythm begins to break into a more varied arrangement of standing trees, younger growth, and occasional gaps. This is part of the ordinary life of birch. In many places, a stand formed after disturbance may remain clearly birch-dominated for some decades, but by roughly 75 to 100 years, later species often begin to take over much of the space. That timing is not exact everywhere. Soil, climate, moisture, and the trees waiting nearby all matter. But the larger pattern remains familiar. Birch often lasts for one main generation in a given stand, and then the balance begins to shift. The forest does not stop being alive. It simply becomes something else. What that something else is depends very much on place. In some northern regions, especially where conifers are already close at hand, the next forest may lean towards spruce and fir. Beneath the birch canopy, young evergreens may have been waiting for years, small and patient in the filtered shade until the older birches began to thin. In other places, especially farther south or in richer hardwood settings, the stand may move toward maples, beeches, or other broad-leaved trees that can tolerate more shade while they are young. The direction of succession is never identical everywhere, because a forest is shaped not only by time, but by region, soil, and the set of species available to follow. Still, the feeling of the change is often similar. Brightness begins to thin. The pale trunks remain, but they no longer define everything. Darker shapes gather beneath them. The understory grows more certain of itself. The birches that once seemed to hold the whole stand together now look more like one layer within a forest that is becoming deeper and more mixed. Their role is no longer to claim open ground. It is to stand for a while longer as the next stage rises around them. There is something gentle in the pace of that transition. It would be easy to imagine succession as a kind of contest, one set of trees replacing another through force. But in many birch forests, the shift feels more like a long, soft rearrangement. One species makes possible the conditions that allow another to gather. One canopy loosens while another slowly forms below. One light pattern fades while another takes shape. Birch does not vanish in anger. It recedes by degrees. If you walked through such a stand at the right moment, you might notice that two forests seem to exist together. Above you, older birches still lift their pale trunks and small leaves into the light. Around your knees and shoulders, younger conifers or hardwood saplings are already defining the future. The birch forest is still present, but it is no longer alone. It is becoming a passage rather than a destination. And even the aging of birch itself fits the character the tree has shown all along. Its bark peels. Its light is bright but never heavy. Its lifespan favors response over permanence. So when a stand begins to thin, the change feels like part of the same larger nature. Birch was never a tree of dense, endless rule. It was a tree of arrival, light, and transition from the beginning. The forest it creates is often temporary, not because it failed, but because temporary was always part of its gift. By the time a birch forest begins giving way, the change is rarely dramatic. It is more like brightness slowly thinning, while another kind of forest gathers beneath it. After spending so much time with paper birch, it helps to widen the view and remember that birch is not a single image repeated across the world. The pale peeling trunk is one of the most famous versions, and perhaps the most instantly recognizable. But the birch family contains many different surfaces, colors, and habits of growth. Once the eye begins to adjust, birch stops being only one tree with white bark and becomes a whole group of related trees, each carrying some familiar traits and some very different ones. Yellow birch is one of the clearest examples. It does not present itself with the same bright white surface as paper birch. Instead, its bark tends toward warm golden bronze tones, sometimes with a kind of soft metallic richness in certain light. The bark still peels, but not in the same broad pale sheets people often picture when they hear the word birch. It may curl in finer strips, and as the tree ages, the trunk can begin to look more irregular, rougher, and more plated. The effect is older, darker, and more textured. If paper birch feels like winter light, yellow birch often feels more like warm bark touched by late afternoon sun. And yet the family resemblance remains. The trunk still carries that layered quality. The bark still draws attention through texture. The leaves still hold that small, toothed precision that birch is known for. Catkins still appear. Seeds still travel on the wind. Even when the color changes, the larger character of the genus stays present. River birch offers another version entirely. Its bark is usually darker, often reddish-brown, cinnamon-toned, or grey-brown, and it peels in shaggy, curling strips that can make the trunk look rougher and more deeply textured than many northern birches. Where paper birch often seems clean and lightly drawn, river birch can look loose, shredded, and full of movement in a more dramatic way. The peeling bark hangs in layers and ribbons, and the trunk may feel more restless to the eye, less bright and still, more earthy and flowing. It is still birch, but it carries itself differently, as though the same family has learned another visual language. Then there is silver birch, a tree strongly associated with parts of Europe, especially northern and eastern landscapes. Silver birch often returns to the pale white surface people know best, but the whole form of the tree can feel more slender and graceful. The branches may hang with a more pendulous quality, giving the crown a softer drooping outline. In open light, a silver birch can seem almost airy to the point of delicacy, with fine twigs, trembling leaves, and a trunk that catches brightness in a very clean way. It shares the whiteness of paper birch, but the posture of the tree may feel lighter, even a little more refined. So within the birch family, the bark alone can move from bright white to golden bronze to reddish brown. It can peel in papery sheets, curl in thin metallic strips, or hang in shaggy ribbons. The trunk may look smooth and luminous, or rougher and more layered with age. One birch may suggest snow and open northern air. Another may suggest damp banks, richer soils, or older, deeper woods. Still, for all that variety, certain things keep returning. Birch leaves tend to be relatively small and finely toothed. The bark usually has some layered or peeling quality, even when the color differs. Catkins remain a central feature of flowering and seed production. The seeds themselves are small and windborne. The trees often carry that same general sense of lightness, even when the bark darkens. Birch does not usually become massive in the heavy, commanding way some other trees do. Even the darker members of the family often retain something a little finer, a little more responsive, a little more open in branch and leaf. That may be why broadening the picture does not weaken the identity of birch. It strengthens it. The more kinds of birch you notice, the more clearly the deeper pattern begins to emerge. Birch is not only white bark. Birch is layered bark. Birch is not only one tone. Birch is a family of shifting surfaces. Birch is not only one climate or one region. It is a way of being a tree, light-seeded, catkin-bearing, often peel-barked, often quick to move into light. And once the eye adjusts to that wider picture, birch stops being one image and becomes something richer, a whole family of related surfaces, colors, and forms. And perhaps that is why people kept reaching for birch across such long stretches of time. Not just noticing it, not just admiring the pale trunks from a distance, but actually using it, carrying it, shaping it, and depending on it. A tree does not enter daily life so deeply unless it offers something unusually practical. Birch did. Its bark was light in the hand, easy to work, resistant to water, and durable enough to last. It could be peeled in sheets that were already useful before much shaping had even begun. That combination is rare. A material can be strong but heavy. It can be light but fragile. It can be flexible but easily spoiled by water. Birch bark sat in a quieter and more useful middle place. It could be bent, folded, cut, stitched, and layered. It was thin, but not weak. It repelled water well enough that containers made from it could hold liquids without leaking. In a northern forest, where every material had to justify the effort of gathering it, that would have mattered immediately. Birch bark did not need to be imagined into usefulness. Its usefulness was already there in the way it peeled from the trunk. So people made baskets from it, and storage containers and mats. They used it for coverings and wraps. In some places it became part of baby carriers, part of the ordinary work of holding, protecting, and transporting life itself. It became part of torches too, because the same bark that shed water and folded so well could also catch flame. A single tree offered a surface that could cover, contain, carry, and light. That is one reason birch feels less like a tree admired from afar and more like a companion species, something brought close to the body and into the hand. Few uses show this more clearly than the birch bark canoe. It is one of the most iconic examples because it reveals so many of the bark's qualities at once. To make a canoe from birch bark is to trust that a thin, peeled surface can become both skin and vessel. The bark had to be light enough to move, broad enough to shape, and water-resistant enough to float. It had to hold against wetness while remaining flexible enough to work with. In that sense, the canoe was not an invention in opposition to the tree. It was an invention built out of the tree's own character. Birch had already solved part of the problem by growing bark that could repel water, bend, and stay intact. People simply learned how to join that material to ribs, seams, and skill. There is something intimate in that kind of use. Not industrial, not distant. Practical in the oldest way. A person peeling bark at the right season. Hands cutting along the trunk. Sheets being carried away and stacked. A basket being folded. A seam being closed. A covering being tied. The tree enters daily life not as lumber first, but as surface. As something already thin, already formed, already halfway to usefulness. Even writing found its way onto birch. Peeled sheets of bark could serve as a surface for messages, markings, and records in more recent times, which gives paper birch one of its most literal names. That too feels fitting. A bark already marked by lenticels and peeling in layers became, in human use, something that could hold another layer of marks. The trunk that looked almost written on by nature could itself become a writing surface. And through all of these uses, what stands out most is not grandeur, but closeness. Birch was not only a tree rising in the background of a landscape. It was something touched often and carefully. Something stripped in season, folded with purpose, and carried into camps, homes, rivers, and journeys. A tree of pale trunks and airy groves became a tree of baskets, mats, containers, torches, and canoes, because its bark offered a rare balance of qualities that people learned to trust. Birch was not admired only from a distance. It was held in the hand, cut, folded, lit, floated, and carried into daily life. And once birch had entered daily life through its bark, it did not stop there. The relationship deepened. What began with thin peeled sheets and water-resistant surfaces extended into wood, into pitch, into tools, into craft, and even into much older histories of human making. Birch is one of those trees that seems to have offered itself in layers not only to the forest, but to people as well. One part gave bark, another gave wood, another gave adhesive, another gave sap. The more closely people lived with birch, the more uses they found waiting inside it. Birch wood has a different character from the bark. It is light, but not flimsy. Flexible, but still dependable. It can be shaped into objects that need some spring and resilience without becoming too heavy to carry. That made it useful for many kinds of implements, paddles, bows, arrows, handles, and other ordinary tools that belong to movement, travel, work, and survival. In this way, birch became part of the built world, not only as covering, but as structure. A tree that could already wrap and protect through its bark could also help make the objects that hands relied on every day. There is something very fitting in birch wood being used for paddles. The bark had already helped make canoes possible, and now the wood helped move them. The tree stayed close to water and travel in more than one form. A peeled surface became the skin of a vessel, while the shaped wood became part of the motion that carried it forward. Birch, in that sense, did not only help people float, it helped them continue. And then there is birch bark pitch, one of the most remarkable examples of how deeply people learn the possibilities inside this tree. When birch bark is heated in low oxygen conditions, it can produce a dark, sticky substance that works as an adhesive. This pitch was used very far back in human prehistory, long before modern glues or manufactured binding agents existed. It allowed stone points, handles, shafts, and other parts to be joined more securely. A tree with bark that already peeled, burned, and resisted water also carried within it the possibility of being transformed into something that could hold separate objects together. That old use gives birch an even longer human history than baskets or canoes alone might suggest. And it reaches back so far that even Neanderthals appear to have made use of birch bark pitch. This does not need to be treated as sensational to feel quietly extraordinary. It simply means that far back in human prehistory, long before metal tools or writing or settled cities, people and close human relatives were already paying careful attention to what birch bark could become under heat. They were already learning that a tree could offer not just fuel or shelter, but an adhesive, a joining substance, a way of making separate parts function as one. That detail changes the feeling of birch in a subtle way. The pale trunk in a modern grove no longer belongs only to forests, canoe roots, or spring sap. It also belongs to very old acts of observation and experimentation. Someone, a very long time ago, noticed what happened when birch bark was treated in a certain way. Someone recognized that the tree could help things stick, hold, and endure. Birch became part of human ingenuity, not only through beauty or convenience, but through transformation. And the uses kept changing as the centuries went on. Birch sap and aromatic compounds found their way into later cultural traditions, such as birch beer, a drink tied not only to sweetness, but to scent and flavor, carried up through the spring-moving sap. The same tree that could be tapped for syrup could also become part of brewed and flavored drinks. So birch remained present not only in what people built and carried, but in what they tasted. What makes all of this feel so cohesive is that none of these uses seem entirely separate from the nature of the tree. The bark peels in sheets, so it becomes wrapping, roofing, writing material, and canoe skin. The bark burns and yields pitch, so it becomes torch and adhesive. The wood is light and workable, so it becomes paddle, bow, and tool. The sap rises clear and slightly sweet, so it becomes syrup and drink. Birch was not forced into usefulness against its nature. Its usefulness emerged from its nature. That is why birch feels less like a tree people simply used and more like a tree people came to know closely over time. Each use required attention. Each one came from handling the bark, shaping the wood, tasting the sap, watching what heat would do, and remembering what worked. The relationship was practical, but it was also observant. Birch became part of human making because people noticed that this one tree carried an unusual number of possibilities. A tree that peels in sheets and burns with ease also became a tree that helped humans build, travel, join, and carry, which gives its pale bark an even deeper history. And after following birch into human hands, it helps to turn back toward the forest and notice how many other lives are gathered around the tree as well. Birch is not only useful to people. It is useful to animals in quiet, ordinary, seasonal ways that can be easy to miss unless you stop and look closely. A birch stand may seem light and still from a distance, but within it, there is often a great deal of small movement, feeding, sheltering, gnawing, pecking, and carrying. The tree is not just standing there, it is being used constantly. Some of the largest animals in northern forests make use of birch in simple, direct ways. Deer browse the twigs and leaves. Moose do the same, especially where young birch is abundant and easy to reach. In some places, elk feed on birch as well, taking advantage of the softer new growth. A stand of young birch, with its many thin stems and reachable branches, can be an especially useful place for this kind of feeding. What looks like a grove of pale trunks to the human eye may, to a browsing animal, be a whole patch of available food. This is especially true in the younger stages of birch growth, when the tree's quick return after disturbance creates exactly the kind of accessible browse that large herbivores can use. Fire, cutting, and opening may create the conditions birch likes, and then birch in turn creates food for the animals that move through those recovering places. So the tree's role in the forest is not only structural, it is nutritional too. Smaller animals use birch differently. Porcupines may gnaw on bark, especially in colder seasons when food is harder to find, and the tree's outer tissues offer something worth chewing. Other small mammals may also feed on bark, twigs, buds, or young shoots depending on the season, and what else is available nearby. In winter, when leaves are gone and the forest looks stripped back to bark and branch, birch can still remain part of the food web in ways that are not obvious until you notice tooth marks, clipped twigs, or the quiet evidence of feeding left on the trunk. The bark itself does more than feed. It also shelters. Those flaking outer layers, the same ones people once peeled for canoes and containers, create small lifted spaces against the trunk. Tiny insects can hide there. Spiders may rest there. Loose bark can make protected little pockets where small creatures are less exposed to wind, cold, and direct view. Even the parts of the tree that seem partly detached remain useful. A strip of bark curling away from the trunk may be, for something very small, enough of a shelter to matter. Birds make use of birch in their own ways too. Some species pull at loose bark and carry it away as nesting material. Thin strips can line nests or become part of the woven structure that holds them together. In that sense, the bark continues its long history of being folded and carried, only now not by human hands, but by beaks moving quickly through spring air. A birch grove may be full of these little thefts, soft pieces taken from the trunk and lifted into branches somewhere else. Sapsuckers add another kind of attention. They may use birch for sap and for the insects drawn to it, drilling small holes that become part of a feeding pattern on the bark. The tree, already full of spring movement, becomes a place where birds return to tap into that movement from the outside. Catkins also matter. In cooler seasons, when other foods are less available, birch catkins and seeds can feed birds that know how to use them. So even after the leaves are gone, birch still offers something to the winged life around it. All of this gives a birch stand a different kind of animation. The grove may still feel quiet, but it is not empty. A moose moving through young stems, a porcupine working at bark in winter, a small bird tugging loose strips into a nest, a sapsucker returning to the trunk, tiny animals sheltering beneath curling layers of bark. These are not dramatic scenes. They are soft forest uses, repeated again and again, part of the ordinary exchange between one tree and many other lives. Birch is not only a tree standing in a forest, it is also a surface, shelter, food source, and seasonal meeting place for many other creatures. And even when birch is no longer living in the full leafy sense, it does not stop participating in the forest. This is one of the quieter things about the tree, and perhaps one of the most moving. Birch often remains present after its life has changed form. The wood may begin to soften, hollow, or loosen from within, yet the bark can continue to hold its shape long after the inner strength has started to give way. A trunk that once stood bright and living may remain behind as a pale shell, a standing memory of the tree's outline. That happens because birch bark and birch wood do not disappear at the same rate. The wood inside may break down relatively quickly, especially once fungi and moisture begin their slow work. But the bark, with its protective compounds, waxes, and layers, can remain intact much longer. So an old birch trunk may become hollow from within, while the bark stays standing, at least for a time. Like a cylinder of pale paper strengthened by habit more than by solid weight. Sometimes these old trunks remain upright as snags, trees that are no longer drawing sap or producing leaves, but are still part of the structure of the woodland. Other times they may break or lean, yet still hold together in long strips or hollow sections. In either case, birch does not simply vanish into the ground the moment its canopy is gone. It lingers. It continues to mark the stand with shape and surface. The pale bark is often still visible long after the rest of the tree has entered another stage. And that lingering matters. Standing birch remains continue to be useful to other creatures. Birds may use old trunks and snags for perching, feeding, or nesting, especially if softening wood has allowed cavities to form. Small shelter-dependent species can find refuge in what remains. Insects enter the aging wood. Woodpeckers may investigate. The standing hollow becomes part of the life of the forest in a different way from the living tree, but it remains part of that life all the same. The birch is no longer making leaves or seeds, but it is still offering space. There is something especially fitting in the way birch lingers like this, because the tree has always been a species of surfaces and layers. Its bark peels in sheets. Its canopies filter light. Its seeds move lightly through open air. So even after the crown has gone quiet, birch remains visible through its outer form. The bark is often the last part to leave. The same material that once resisted water, lit fires, lined canoes, and sheltered insects now helps the older trunk continue standing for a while longer. What protected the tree in life helps preserve its outline afterward. If you walk through an older birch stand, you might notice one of these remains without fully realizing at first what you were seeing. A pale trunk still upright, but too quiet. No crown above. No movement in branches. Perhaps a break high up where the living top was lost some time ago. Or a hollow shell where the center has softened away. It would not feel dramatic. It would feel still. Another presence in the stand, lighter and emptier than before, but not without purpose. That is one of the gentler truths of a forest. Not all usefulness belongs only to what is fully growing in the obvious sense. A standing birch trunk can still shelter birds. It can still host insects. It can still shape the look of the woods and hold a place in the web of use around it. Even rot has work to do. Even hollowness makes room. And because birch so often occupies that middle part of forest time, growing quickly after disturbance and then yielding as other trees gather beneath it, this later stage feels very much in keeping with the whole rhythm of the species. Birch does not tend to leave the forest all at once. It passes through forms: living trunk, aging trunk, hollow trunk, snag, fallen log, softening wood, bark strip. The tree continues to participate in the place through each of those changes, only differently. So the later life of birch is not empty. It is quieter, slower, more structural, but still meaningful. The tree keeps holding shape after the crown has gone still. It keeps offering shelter after growth has stopped. It remains part of the forest not only in memory, but in matter. Even when birch is no longer living in the full sense, it continues to hold shape, shelter, and presence, which makes its disappearance less like an ending than another kind of participation. And perhaps by now the whole tree has come into focus a little more clearly. Not only the white bark that first catches the eye, and not only the thin papery layers that make birch seem so unlike other trees, but the larger pattern that those details belong to. Birch is a tree of pale surfaces and filtered light, of quick return and quiet usefulness, of open canopies, wind-borne seeds, and bark that can repel water, reflect winter sun, and still burn with surprising ease. The more closely it is followed, the more it seems to gather many different qualities into one calm form. It is easy at first to think of birch mainly as a visual tree, a tree of white trunks, black marks, yellow autumn leaves, and airy groves. And it is that. Few trees are so instantly recognizable. Few reshape the look of a forest so quickly just by standing there. Birch can make a woodland feel brighter, more breathable, more open to the sky. It can turn a slope of mixed growth into something lighter and clearer simply by the way its bark and leaves hold light. Even in winter, when so much of the forest withdraws into darker tones, birch remains visible. But birch has never been only a matter of appearance. The bark that looks so delicate is part of a larger strategy. It reflects hard winter light. It sheds water. It helps protect the tree through freeze and thaw. The trunk is marked by lenticels that allow exchange to continue. Even before spring becomes visible in leaves, sap is already moving upward from the roots, and that movement can be tasted. Birch gives itself to the season not in one sudden gesture, but in early hidden transitions that begin before the forest notices. Its whole life seems to follow that same rhythm of transition. Birch often appears where something has already changed. Fire has passed. Logging has opened the canopy. Wind has cleared a patch of older trees. Ground that was once shaded has become bright again, and birch responds to those openings almost as if it has been waiting for them. Seeds travel on the wind. Young stems rise quickly. Pale trunks begin to gather in places that looked empty only a little while before. The tree does not simply endure change. It specializes in arriving after it. And then, even as it grows, it begins preparing the conditions for another change still to come. Its leaves fall and shape the upper soil. Its canopy filters light without blocking it too completely. Shade-tolerant seedlings begin to gather beneath it. Over time, the birch grove thins, opens differently, and gives way. Not abruptly, not as a failure, more like a handoff, one forest making room for another. This may be why birch feels so memorable. It is not a tree of permanent rule. It is a tree of passage. It belongs to beginnings, to middles, to bright intervals between heavier chapters. Even after the trunk is no longer fully living, even when wood has softened and the bark remains standing as a hollow shell, birch continues to take part. It shelters insects. It holds birds. It remains as structure in the woods. The tree keeps contributing even after its crown has gone quiet. And people noticed all of this in their own way. They peeled the bark and folded it. They wrapped, carried, stored, floated, lit, and wrote on it. They shaped the wood into tools and used the pitch to join other materials together. They tapped the spring sap and boiled it down. Birch moved from grove to hand, not because it was merely admired, but because it kept offering itself in useful forms. It became part of travel, shelter, making, and memory. So perhaps that is part of why birch lingers so strongly in the human mind. It is a tree that seems to stand in the middle of things, between winter and spring, between fire and regrowth, between one forest and the next. It catches light, but does not keep it only for itself. It appears where change has already happened, and it remains while another change begins quietly underneath. It is a tree built not for stillness in the absolute sense, but for gentle passage, for return, for the kind of life that arrives early, brightens a place for a while, and then makes room. And in that way, birch may be one of the clearest reminders that a tree does not need to be the heaviest, oldest, or most permanent thing in the forest to matter deeply. Sometimes, what matters most is the species that knows how to begin again. The species that turns opening into growth, brightness into protection, and a thin, pale surface into one of the most distinctive lives a forest can hold. Perhaps that is part of why birch lingers so strongly in the human mind. It is a tree that seems to stand in the middle of things, between winter and spring, between fire and regrowth, between one forest and the next, quietly asking what kind of life arrives first and what kind of life comes after.